Hello everybody, my name is Rob Gardner, and for over 20 years I've been playing the game of poker and helping people just like you get better at the game and have more fun playing poker. Today I want to tackle one of the common mistakes I see casual and recreational poker players make, which is trying to put their opponents on an exact poker hand. By the end of this video, you'll understand why focusing on ranges or just eliminating a couple hands from your opponent's range instead of trying to put your opponent on an exact hand is a much better process for thinking about poker and playing better poker in specific situations. So why does trying to guess your opponent's exact hand not work? Well, first off, there are over 1,326 different combinations of hands in the most common game, Texas Hold'em. If you're playing games like Pineapple or Omaha or Big O, the combinations go up exponentially from there. So the idea that you can just narrow your opponent down to one hand from all 1,326 combinations is just not realistic. I think for some players, the fun and the mystery of trying to figure that out adds to the excitement of the game. But there's one huge problem with this, and that is our bias. Now, bias is a massive thing in poker. If you've ever heard poker players talk about, I always run bad, I never win with aces, I never win with ace king. These are all biases from past experiences that we're allowing to muddy the waters of what the actual situation is. There's a lot of situations I get in with my poker students where I'll ask them, why did you make this play? And they'll tell me, well, I just really thought he had blah, blah. And we'll start talking about why they thought that that opponent had that particular hand. And what I end up really hearing is they had a bias that came out. So instead, what we want to do is think about opponents' ranges. Now, if you've been around poker for any length of time and you've taken any study courses and been a part of study groups, you've probably heard and know this concept of thinking about opponents in terms of their ranges. But I've got news for you. This is where people also mess up because they realize, okay, well, yeah, I'm not supposed to put an opponent on an exact hand. So as long as I'm not putting them on an exact hand, it's okay. And then they'll narrow their range to something really, really, really tiny. Like, oh, we got to the river and I just knew he had a set, or I just knew he had a flush, or I just knew he had two pair. They still try to condense their opponent's range either to extreme value or extreme bluffs, depending on where their biases are shifting them in that moment. So it's more than just thinking about it in ranges. What we have to do is think about it in a spectrum. Now, there are very, very, very few players out there who never, ever bluff. Sure, there are players that bluff more than others, and there are players that tend not to bluff often. But the number of players who bluff absolutely 0% of the time are incredibly small, and usually they're incredibly obvious because they play 3 hands in an entire tournament or cash session. The other 99.99% of players do anything from bluffing a small amount of time to a large amount of time. So because of that, we should never be thinking about our opponents in the range of just literally only having a very small subset of hands that are either all value or all bluffs. Instead, what we should be thinking about is how much value they have and how much bluffs they have and what that ratio kind of looks like. Do they have a lot of value and only a few bluffs? Do they have a lot of bluffs and only a few value? Do they have equal amounts of both? Now, this is a little bit more of an advanced topic, and for some of you, that can be overwhelming. So what you can do is take a step back, and instead of trying to think of all the hands they could have, just eliminate some of the obvious hands they don't have. In fact, one of the ways we can improve at poker is doing this on each street. You get to the flop, you get some information about your opponent, and you try to whittle down just a few of the obvious hands you know your opponent doesn't have. Then you get to the turn, you get more information, you whittle it down from there. You get to the river, you get more information, you whittle it down from there. And that just helps you eliminate some of the hands so you can kind of get a rough idea of how strong your opponent is. It's never going to be an exact science, and it's never going to be perfect. But the more we get comfortable with that, especially when we can get to the river and think back through the flop and the turn as a whole picture, the better we get. Now, there's one last trick with this that's really, really important, and it's a very common mistake a lot of my students make. And that's that they try to insert their thought process into their opponents. They try to assume that because they would never do something, that their opponents would never do something. And this is a common mistake I see where I'll go through a hand and we'll be talking to the spot and they'll be like, well, he never has aces there. And I'll say, well, why does he never have aces there? It's like, well, because he would have raised aces on the flop. Well, why do you think he would have raised aces on the flop? Well, that's what I would do. I'm always raising aces on the flop. Well, that's what you would do, but there's a lot of different styles and a lot of different ways people play. And just because something is common sense or logic or really obvious to you doesn't mean it's common sense or logic or really obvious to your opponents. So again, it's very, very important that we do not get dramatic and drastic when we think about opponents' ranges and just try and cram them down into some really tiny range, because a lot of times, even there, we're taking our bias about how we think and trying to apply it to how our opponents think. And especially if we're trying to be better players and we're trying to play this game at a better level, then we're already distancing ourselves from where the average player is and how the average player thinks. Early in my career, I loved putting my opponents on hands, and if I could figure out exactly what their hand was and call them on it, it was the sickest rush and it made me feel like the greatest poker player in the world. But it was a terrible habit and it did not help me get better at the game. Over time, I've adapted my skills, my hand reading skills, my ability to go from flop to turn to river and eliminate parts of opponents' range. And more importantly, I've spent time studying different types of opponents and getting better at thinking and understanding how an average poker player thinks and understands things. And that experience has helped me get better at it. But even with all that experience and playing this game for 20 plus years, it's still insanely rare that I ever bring my opponent's range down to just a handful of hands. If you've gotten to this stage in the video, we appreciate it. It is your turn now. Hit that like button down below. Drop a comment about your experiences with hand reading, situations where you put your opponent on an exact hand, where it's gone right, where it's gone wrong. And make sure you hit that like button as well. Next Monday's video, you're not going to miss it. I'm going to be talking about why training sites are both very good and very bad for you. We'll see you next week.